McDonnell.
Mr. Speaker, like me, you'll have witnessed many autumn statements and statements by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And you'll know that there's such a thing as the iron law of Chancellor's statements. And the iron law of Chancellor's statements is that the louder the cheers for the statement on the day, the greater the disappointment by the weekend when the analysis goes in. But from what we've heard today, we don't need until the weekend for this statement to fall apart. Over the last 5 years, there's barely been a target the Chancellor's set he hasn't missed or hasn't ignored. 5 years ago, the newly elected Chancellor and the Prime Minister came to this House and warned us that because of the dire economic situation our country faced, what was needed was a 5-year programme of austerity measures, job cuts, wage freezes and cuts in public services. But we were promised specifically by this Chancellor that by today the deficit would be eliminated and debts would be under control. And debt would be under control and falling dramatically. People put their trust in that commitment.
Order. I said earlier that the Prime Minister would be heard. The Shadow Chancellor will be heard too. And if people think they're being clever, shouting their heads off, don't bother trying to ask a question. Try at least to have the sense to realise the conflict between the two. Mr. John McDonnell.
The Prime Minister also assured us, Mr. Speaker, that though it was going to be hard and sacrifices had to be made, we were all in it together. 5 years on. So can I just say today that the Chancellor's got some front to come to this House and to talk to us about deficit and to lecture us about deficit reduction. Today is the day when the Chancellor was supposed to announce austerity was over, the deficit was consumed. From what people have heard today, I think they'll feel absolutely betrayed. The reality is this, that after 5 years, the deficit has not been eliminated, and this year it's predicted to be over £70 billion. Instead of taking 5 years to eliminate the deficit, as he promised, it's going to take 10. And debt to GDP will not be the 69% he promised 5 years ago. As he said today, it will be 82.5%. And we're now potentially to bequeath to our children a debt of £1.5 trillion. £1.5 trillion. Their debt. The Chancellor continues to miss.
Both sides are still shouting their heads off. It's very down market, it's very low grade, it's very widely deprecated by the public. How it is that people think that it's legitimate to behave in that way and try to reconnect with the electorate disillusioned with politics is just bizarre. And if some people are so unintelligent they still can't grasp the point, I pity them. John McDonnell.
After 5 years as Chancellor, with that level of debt, there's nobody else for him to blame. There's only so long you can blame past governments. There's no more excuses for this Chancellor after 5 years. And we were also promised, if sacrifices had to be made to tackle the deficit, not to worry, we were all in this together. No, we're not. 85% of the money saved from tax and benefit cuts in the last Parliament came directly out of women's pockets. Disabled people were hit 18 times harder than anybody else. 4.1 children now live in absolute poverty, an increase of 500,000 from 2009-10. And the fiasco over tax credits demonstrated once and for all that we were not in this together. At the same time as the Chancellor was planning to cut tax credits to working families, he cut inheritance taxes for some of the wealthiest families in this country. When the Chancellor and the Prime Minister were first elected to their current positions, they were attacked for being posh boys. I disagreed with that strongly. It was unfair. People don't choose what class they're born into or the wealth they inherit. Nevertheless, if you're fortunate enough to have wealth or good incomes, as all MPs, the onus is upon us to take particular care when you're taking decisions about the lives of those less fortunate than yourselves. I think what shocked and indeed angered many, not just in this House but across the country, is the way in which there was no attempt by the Chancellor to understand the effects of the decision to cut tax credits. For many families, it would have been a choice between children being able to go on that school trip like other children, or having a decent Christmas or a winter coat. Today, the Chancellor has been forced into a U-turn on his tax credits. And I want to congratulate the members in this House on all sides who made this happen. I want to congratulate the members in the other House as well. I'm glad he's listened to Labour and seen sense. But as ever with this Chancellor, we await further clarification on the details, particularly if the limit to 2 children remains. And we're aware of the impact on universal credit. It appears that the 14,000 families already on universal credit will still suffer the full cut. And all families that would newly qualify for tax credits in 2018 will suffer the full cut under universal credit. So this is not a full and fair reversal as we pleaded for. And the Chancellor remains committed to £12 billion of welfare cuts over the course of this Parliament. And we know where they'll fall on the most vulnerable, the poorest, and those just struggling to survive. Some believe that the Chancellor is using the deficit and austerity to reshape the role of the British state, that this is some well-thought-through Machiavellian scheme. Well, I don't anymore. I don't. I'm convinced that this is sheer economic illiteracy built upon incompetence and poor judgment. Poor judgment. Today, only 4 weeks ago, he brought to this House the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility. Essential part of that was adherence to his welfare cap, which we supported. Today, he's broken his own welfare cap. And let me say what he said before. He said himself, introducing the cap last year, breaking it would be, and I quote the Chancellor, a failure of public expenditure control. On his own terms, in his own language, condemned. The government is cutting today and not investing in the future. He's putting us all at future risk. Let me say this. I want to congratulate the honourable member for Lee for the campaign on policing cuts, which is forced a U-turn. We don't forget, though. Mr. Speaker, we don't forget, though, that we face the highest level of risk from terrorist attack in a generation. But we've already lost 17,000 police officers under cuts under this government. We know that the first line of intelligence collection and prevention and response are the local police officers in the community. So we claim today as another Labour gain and victory. Let me say also, there are concerns now about the impact of the local council cuts and freezes in expenditure on other emergency services. We feel for the people's safety as more firefighters' jobs are cut and fire stations close as a result of this settlement today. In health, the Chancellor has announced he's front-loading part of the additional £8 billion worth of funding. In reality, this will only plug some of the gap in the huge deficits health trusts are reporting, but the government is also relying upon £22 billion worth of unrealistic savings to be found. The extra money seems to be coming from nurses' training, the public health budget, and other aspects of local authority support around care. This will be a false economy which will simply cause more burdens to fall on the NHS. All the signs are that we are facing a massive winter crisis in our NHS, and yet again we'll have to rely upon the professional dedication of our staff. The Health Secretary refusing to go to ACAS to settle the junior hospital doctors' dispute is no way to maintain the morale amongst our NHS professionals. One of the greatest scandals under this Chancellor has been the attack on social care. 3,000 beds have been lost already. And according to the Association of Directors of Adult Services, the care precept, the 2% announced by the Chancellor, is not nearly enough to fill the funding gap this government has created. The result is that some of the most vulnerable people in our society will be at risk, and more people will be forced to resort to their local hospital for their care. We also know much more about the scale of people suffering from mental health problems, and we welcome the additional funding today devoted to mental health. But it is no use funding through the health service for mental health support when local authority support is being cut as a result of this settlement. More people will be left vulnerable. In education, the government claims that school budgets will be protected. But let me say this, we fear that the government will use the new funding formula to take away from the pupils who most need it, the most deprived. And we will monitor the funding formula carefully to ensure equity. In today's statement, the Chancellor has announced that for FE there will be a settlement which restricts it to cash protection. In effect, what that means is sixth forms and further education colleges will be under threat at risk of closure around the country. And just at a time when the economy is crying out for a skilled, educated workforce, the government is denying access to young people to the local courses they need. And with regard to childcare announced today, we note it is delayed yet again another 2 years. Another delay in a commitment given. The Chancellor's much vaunted place today on house building is cobbled together from reheated promises from the past. The vast majority have already been announced. The Tories should be judged by their actions, not their words. The Chancellor's first act in office was to slash housing investment by 60%. His plans today could still mean 40% less to build the homes we need, compared to the investment programme he inherited from Labour. House building now, as a result, remains at the lowest peacetime level since the 1920s. And as my honourable colleague member for Wakefield said this morning, if hot air built homes, then Conservative ministers would have solved our housing crisis. But I worry that the vast majority of young people hoping for new homes will be disappointed by the Chancellor's failure to deliver. His record on building anything so far does not inspire confidence at all. Over the last year, the Chancellor has forced himself onto building sites all around the country to secure a photo with a high-vis jacket. When the Chancellor did his Bob the Builder speech at Tory party conference, what he didn't tell delegates was that his abysmal investment record. Only 9% of the projects that have started under his infrastructure pipeline in 2 years. In 2012, he announced a £40 billion guarantee scheme. 3 years on, only 9% again has been signed up. In 2011, he announced a £20 billion pensions infrastructure platform, but 4 years on, only £1 billion of commitments has been secured. The construction industry is actually shrinking this year and going into recession. But he's also failed to invest in skills. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors has said that the biggest infrastructure programmes could grind to a halt unless the government adopts new measures to tackle the skills and funding. And the most ironic cut of all must be the virtual closure of large sections of the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. There are 146,000 unfilled vacancies due to the lack of a skilled workforce. So naturally, the government's solution is to move to effectively close the one department tasked with increasing skill levels. On the environment, the government has announced today various measures, but let's be very clear. Government ministers can go to the Paris Summit on climate change with the proud record of nearly killing off our once flourishing solar renewable energy sector. And on international aid, let me caution, the international aid budget is supposedly protected, but is now to be raided for defence spending. In defence, the government has previously commissioned an aircraft carrier last year, a few years ago, and at least woken up to the fact that it needed aircraft as well. But the funding of the defence review is to come from £11 billion worth of cuts, with the inevitable loss of thousands of defence worker jobs, whose specialist skills will be lost forever. Alongside these cuts and many more, to help dig himself out of the financial hole he's got himself into, the Chancellor is selling off whatever public assets he can. This is no longer the family silver up for sale. This is the furniture, the fixtures and the fittings. And we know who's the first in line to buy. Can I just say, I never envisaged that when it came to nationalising, I would be outdone by a Conservative Chancellor. The only difference between us is that I would like to bring services like rail back into the ownership of the British people. The Chancellor wants to sell them to the People's Republic of China. Nationalisation is OK for him, as long as it's by any other state but ours. To assist Comrade Osborne in his dealings with his newfound comrades, I brought him along Mao's little red book. Let me quote, Mr. Speaker.
Order! I want to hear about the contents of the book.
I think you'll find this invaluable. Well, let me offer. I thought this would help him, Mr. Speaker. Let's quote from Mao, rarely done in this chamber. The quote is this. Behave. We must learn to do economic work from all who know how, no matter who they are. We must esteem them as teachers, learning from them respectfully and conscientiously. But we must not to pretend to know what we do not know. I thought it would come in handy for him in his new relationship. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure in this debate, Mr. Speaker, that Tory backbenchers will be under instruction to shoehorn into their speeches at every opportunity references to the mythical long-term economic plan. What we've been presented with today is not an economic plan, but a political fix. It's not a plan when you ridiculously commit yourselves to unachievable policies and leave yourself no room to manoeuvre. It's not a plan when you sell off every long-term asset you have for short-term gain. It's not a plan when you leave important industries to go to the wall, as they've done with steel. And it's not a plan when you cut the support for those in work and leave working families to rely upon food banks. And it's not a plan when you force councils up and down the land to close the very services that people depend upon. And it's not a plan when you invest so little in skills and infrastructure that you put our future at risk. Instead, what we've seen today is the launch of a manifesto for the Conservative leadership election. Our long-term economic security is being sacrificed for the benefit of one man's career. But I say to the honourable member for Maidenhead and I say to the honourable lady for Maidenhead and my neighbour, he's gone, the honourable member for Uxbridge, don't worry. The economic reality that's emerging in our economy will mean that this will be seen as the apex of the Chancellor's career. The honourable member for Uxbridge, the honourable member for Uxbridge, the honourable member for Uxbridge, who exudes classical references in his speech, will recognise in the Chancellor Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun and burnt and crashed. I fear for the Chancellor that it's all downhill from here. For on this side of the House, we'll do all we can to ensure that he doesn't take this economy and country down with him. In the end, this debate is about what sort of society we want to live in. In the end, this debate is about what sort of society we want to live in. The government is systematically dismantling all those aspects of our society that make our community worth living in and celebrating. The Chancellor is not just cutting our services today, he's selling it off our future. But there is an alternative. And our alternative will be that we will eliminate the deficit, but we'll do it fairly and effectively. We will do it by ensuring that we end the tax cuts to the rich. We tackle tax evasion and avoidance, and we invest to grow. And we will grow our economy on the basis of the investments in skills and infrastructure. We will become, in addition to the financial centre of Europe, with the research in science and technology, we will become the technology centre of Europe under a Labour government. And that means high skills, high investment, high wages. That is what we're committed to on this side, and that is what we'll secure when we return to office.